Okay, so welcome back to the module on communication disorders. In this video, we want to take a look at how to make accommodations and modifications for students with communication disorders in the classroom. And one of the key things that we want to do is provide them with some form of communication. And typically how we do this is through assistive technology. Now that can mean low tech to high tech, and we're going to take a look at some examples here in a minute. But what augmentative and alternative communication means is it means that we're replacing verbal communication with an object that allows the student to communicate. Typically has some integrated components within it, either icons or an electronic device that does it for us. And those can look like things like a communication book, which is very low tech, all the way to voice output devices and language boards. All of these things can be individualized for the student's needs. So here in a little bit you'll take a look at a video of a student who communicates by eye gaze. Sometimes we have students that use communication boards with touch, that they touch with. Eye gaze is another form of doing that. Sometimes we have electronic voice that's generated versus just looking at the icon that they're touching and using that as the form of communication. So let's take a look at some ranges of what types of augmentative communication we could use in the classroom. Let's start with no tech first, okay? No tech ways to communicate. We of course have vocalizations. We can have facial expressions, so even asking a student who has apraxia and does not speak, maybe even to raise eyebrows for yes and to lower eyebrows for no, would be a way to do facial expression. Manual signs, so we can teach some simple sign language to a student to use for communication, or gestures, teaching some gesture type communication. We all know that we communicate through body language, and so sometimes we can pick up communication just through the student's body language. So these are kind of no tech options. The low tech options really are just examples of how we can do communication concepts, whether through pictures or icons or photographs. Sometimes students are able to write to communicate, or we use communication boards or books. We're going to take a look at some examples of those here in a little bit. And then we get into the high tech. So here we're talking about using a specific device, a technology device that allows us to communicate. Some of those are like just a single message device. So you have what's called a switch. As the student touches that switch, it's just a real simple single button that communicates one single recorded message for the student. And then you have some dynamic language devices that we typically use like on an iPad or a computer that are very interactive. So Josie uses one of these devices when she's in a hearing environment. She has an iPad that the school has provided for her, and it has Prologue Quo 2 on it, which is an app that you can purchase that's a language communication app. Okay, it's one of the more widely used apps for communication. It's all very individualized. She has her core vocabulary that you can see here, and this never changes in terms of what words are on here and where the words are located, so that she can kind of memorize it, and it increases her speed in using it. Just like the keyboard, you know, if we started changing around on our keyboard where the G was or where the H was, think about how hard that would be for us to type, right? So one of the key things that we do is we keep these all the same on her home screen. And then she has folders that she can open. So for example, right now she has a places folder open that has all the frequent places that she goes to, and that allows you to expand the vocabulary a little bit. So she has folders down here for things like feelings, actions, food, people, things, places, fun, times, talk to me, which is just a real simple some communication language and words here that she can use when we're just having a conversation back and forth. And then questions, so questioning words. like what's next, how long, those kinds of things. So just to give you an example of sound on this, let me make sure we're turned up here. And I'll do one for you. So,
I can.
Let's see. For my verbs.
With you. I can go with you.
Okay. So as she selects the icon, it says it, and then if you double tap,
I can go with you.
Up in the sentence, it will play the whole sentence, and then she can start over. Also, there's a keyboard on here, so she can just type words, and it has word prediction, which is really nice. She's getting very fluent at using that. And you know, that's kind of built into some of the devices that you and I use all the time, like our iPhones. Or if you use a smartphone to text, a lot of times it's doing word prediction. So Josie texts very well. That's another form of communication for her. And she uses that word prediction to help her text quickly. And so this is something that we're continuing to work on. She's had it for about 6 months. Typically to master a device like this, it takes 3 to 4 years. We do a lot of modeling at home. So I'll use the device to communicate so that she sees kind of how we can use it to communicate, which is really important for her. This is very high tech, okay? It's still using finger touch to go even further in terms of how complicated the technology can be. We could use eye gaze and those kinds of things, which we'll see pretty soon. But this is a great example of providing students with a format for communicating. So Josie has multiple ways to communicate. She signs, but she needed an option for when she was around people who didn't know sign language. And so that's her alternative communication form when she's with folks who are hearing. So I want to take a look quickly at a video that I think is just helpful in terms of
it's Macy's
kind of giving us an example.
Sale with over 25,000.
Turn down our sound here on our ad. Macy's, our video will play here pretty soon. But just an example of how a student uses eye gaze to communicate, which I think is really helpful.
I have a question for you. Do you understand everything I say?
Yeah.
Some people think you can't understand them.
Yeah.
How does that make you feel?
That's terrible.
Tell me about your mom.
Oh no.
Drink.
He's outgoing, he's contagious, he's funny. He's got lots of little girlfriends.
What do you want to say to all the ladies out there? Thank you for interviewing with me.
See ya.
Okay, so that's a really good example of how a student uses eye gaze to communicate. You know, sometimes we think a student may not physically be able to manually operate a communication device, but there's alternatives out there for helping students do that. And think about how much we would be missing out on that student's personality, on what he has to say, on his learning if he didn't have that opportunity to communicate. So it's really critical. One of the other things I want to just kind of point out to you is when we're looking at no-tech or low-tech ideas, we're looking at communication devices and those kinds of things. Communication boards are something that we can use frequently with students. So providing them with the icons that they just physically touch to communicate. If you don't have access to something that you can use to develop the communication board, one of the things I would suggest to you is to look at Teachers Pay Teachers, and I have a link to this in our module activities. But what you can do here is you can purchase communication boards for a variety of different things in terms of looking at core language, They even have things specific to a particular book, like this one is on Brown Bear, communication board, and activities that you can do with it. They provide you with all the icons, which is really helpful. And then you can manipulate and use those however you want. But if you don't know where to start, or you don't have the resources you feel like to do it, some of these things are fairly cheap. Like this one is just a leveled core language board. It's a really simple one for $3. You can get some other simple ones for under $5. And then you can get some pretty detailed, comprehensive ones. So for example, a year of communication that you can work on for $15. But still, that's not a lot when you consider how much effort it would take to recreate this yourself. So if you have a student that you're thinking about using a communication device, even if it's one of those low tech, like developing some kind of communication book for them that has icons they can flip through, I would suggest looking at that resource. It's really good. One of the things I want to talk about, and this is not in the text, but I think it's so important, is talking about the myths of augmentative communication, because I think there's a lot of myths out there. I know even myself, before I started working with augmentative communication and students who used it, I kind of fell into thinking that some of these myths were accurate. One of the things that is common thought out there is that if we introduce an alternative communication for students, it will reduce their motivation to improve natural speech, and it will hinder their language development. One of the most important things that we need to realize is as we give students a format for communication, it is going to increase their language development twofold. So even if we're providing them with a communication device that is separate from natural speech, in the end, we will see significant growth in their language compared to if we did not do that and we only focused on the production of sounds and words through verbal natural speech. Okay? It doesn't mean that we're going to wait until they have natural speech to provide that communication device. Any time that we can provide communication and we can increase language, whether that's through a communication device or through natural speech, it is extremely beneficial for the student. So if you're working with a student and you think, man, even if you're working with like a 2-year-old and you're saying, I really feel like we need to focus on natural speech and not use a communication device, it's still beneficial for that student to have that communication device and be improving language, making the connections in the brain about how language works that they'll apply later as that natural speech develops, if it's going to. The other important thing to know in terms of a myth is sometimes we think, let's just wait until they get into kindergarten and then we'll look at a communication device for them. Really, it's so helpful to train the mind to process language and use that communication device even as a young age. You can make so much gain in language development when you're doing it with young children. So don't hesitate if you're in a preschool environment to start using even one of those low-tech concepts for language. Think about how further that student's going to be along in terms of being ready to learn, having some fluency, and getting ready for literacy development as you're improving their vocabulary and their language. Even if it's in an icon-based system, like with a communication book, it's still critical for them. So don't hesitate to do that even with your really young kids. The other thing that I think is really important to note is sometimes we fall within this trap of thinking, I'm working with a student with really significant intellectual disability. The cognitive functioning is really low. I don't think that they're going to be able to, I don't feel like they even have the understanding of cause and effect to understand that if I touch the word stop, that means I'm communicating stop. So I don't think that student's ready for a communication device. Don't let that stop you from trying and working on a communication device with that student. One of the things that we have found and that research has found is that the development of language can really lead to some cognitive gains. So as we're working with that student who maybe doesn't know cause and effect yet, as we're working on cause and effect within the concept of language, they'll start to gain that skill, and it will lead to increased cognitive gains. Research also shows us that it really improves social communication, and it also provides these students a foundation for literacy. So don't let a cognitive deficit hold you back on trying a communication device with students that you're working with. Working with students with communication disorders really allows us to integrate UDL in a variety of ways. One of the things that we can do is use different audio and text formats to help meet students' communication needs. And then we can also use things like graphic organizers, which I'm going to show you some examples here in a minute, and really teach controlled vocabulary. So really making sure that we focus on vocabulary, that we're focusing on how to pronounce words, and we focus on the meaning of words is really critical for these students. One of the tools that a school that I work with uses is called Pebble Go. It's a resource for elementary age students, but we even find that middle school students that are reading at a lower level benefit for this. This is a great communication tool to use. It provides text on a variety of areas. So let me go back to the home here so you can see it. You've got animal science, biographies, and social studies. Right now we're working on inventors in a class that I'm helping do some curriculum planning for, and we're working on providing students with kind of a variety of challenging texts. They have some students with communication disorders. Their reading fluency is a little bit lower, so we're trying to find some accommodations. And this is one of the things we're going to do. They're going to read the text on Pebble Go. The nice thing is this also reads for them, and it highlights the word as it's reading. I'll give you an example here.
Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone. He used it for the first time on March 10th, 1876.
Okay, so that just provides some assistance and accommodation in terms of accessing the text for the student, which I think is really important. The other thing that can be really helpful is graphic organizers. And let me skip ahead here to our graphic organizers. This is a great instructional strategy. The book talks about for elementary and middle school, but I think it's also really effective for high school students to kind of help them make that transition from reading to writing and developing literacy skills. So these are things that you can find these online pretty readily. I included a link within the resources on some that I really like to use, but it just provides a visual representation. It helps organize the concepts for the students, really critical. This one here is on identifying main idea and supporting details. Another one that I like to use a lot is on kind of understanding a story, so identifying the main characters, the setting, the plot, the problem solution, really identifying those clearly and having the student write those out can be helpful. And then looking at different characters, so as you get into more challenging reading, looking at character traits and some evidence that was provided to support that character trait. So these things are super effective. They've been around for a long time. Probably in school you used graphic organizers, but it's something that is really beneficial for our students with communication disorders, especially our students with language disorders that have trouble with some of those things like pragmatics and semantics and really making a connection between reading and what they're writing. These are really helpful for students. I want to go back to planning for some other educational needs. One of the things that we know that students with communication disorders can struggle with is social skills. So it's really important for these students to focus on expressively teaching those social skills. So modeling those social skills, having them practice those social skills in lots of different settings. One of the things that we can use is writing a social story, which allows us to kind of describe a social concept and provide information about that situation and the people that are involved. For example, maybe writing a social story if they're having trouble out on the playground. They want to swing every day and someone's always in the swing, so how do we problem solve that? Writing a social story, providing them with really specific examples of things that they can say and communicate to their peers to help them work through that problem. Again, if you do a search for social stories, you're going to find a lot of resources out there. I'll provide some resources within the module folder related to that as well. Scoot through this one real quick since we covered it. Okay, so looking at secondary and transition, one of the biggest things that we're going to give our students with lower functioning autism who are nonverbal, or our students with intellectual disabilities who are nonverbal, is a form of communication. It's going to be critical for them as adults. And so looking at, one of the most effective instructional strategies to focus on for our secondary and transition students is communication, and learning how to use a communication device, whether that's a really simple board like you see here that has simple images, or if that's complicated like an electronic communication device like an iPad, or using sign language. It's really critical that we focus on that student being as fluent in that communication system as they can be by the time they move on into adulthood. And we really want to focus on teaching communication. So we don't necessarily want to focus on specifically teaching the device. It's more of how are we communicating and really focusing on that communication. We've got to teach a little bit about the device, but the main focus we want to focus on is really teaching that communication. Typically, our students with communication disorders, if they have a speech disorder, a lot of that student progress monitoring is going to be done by the speech-language pathologist. If they have a language disorder, a lot of that's going to be done through curriculum-based measurements with their writing and their reading work. And so I think that's just important for you to note as you have students with speech-language disorders on your IEP caseload in terms of what it looks like when we're measuring those students' progress. When we talk about state assessments for these students, some of the accommodations we can look at typically for our students with language disorders, speech disorders, is additional time or access to a word processor or computer software to produce what they would have written, allowing them to type that, which is really helpful. So that's just something I think you should consider as you're developing that IEP. Think about how they develop written work in the classroom, what's the typical manner that they do that, and ensuring that we have that accommodation built into the assessments. Now, again, we could spend so much time talking about communication disorders. We could spend a whole semester just on communication devices. We're just scratching the surface here. If you have specific questions about kids that you've worked with or work with currently related to communication, please don't hesitate to reach out to me with those questions. We're going to work on a language activity to complete this module in a discussion forum. So I look forward to kind of seeing your thoughts on communication disorders as you submit that final work.